This next fly we'll tie is the Royal Wullf. This is sort of the quintessential Western attractor dry fly. It's got big bushy wings, a hair tail, very buoyant, lots of hackle, easy to see, and it's a pretty fly as well. It's one of the most popular flies around. It is a little complicated to tie, and it's got some more delicate steps, but we're going to go through and I'll try to make this as easy as we can as we tie the Royal Wullf. We're going to start with the Tiemco 100 SP. In this case it's a size 14. The tail is going to be moose hawk, which is a stiff dark hair that we're going to use to make a nice stiff tail to hold up the bend of the fly. The wings I'll use calf body hair. Conventionally they're usually tied with calf tail hair. Calf body hair is much easier to work with, although a little harder to find good quality stuff. This hair does make the fly a lot easier to use though. The body is going to be made out of 3 parts, 2 parts peacock curl and 1 part red floss. And we're going to rib over the top of that with some copper wire just to reinforce things. We're going to finish the fly off with brown hackle, a nice dense heavy collar of brown hackle. So to get started, we're going to use some A-dot black thread. I'll start this thread just behind the hook eye, and I'll wrap back to about the midpoint on the hook. I'm going to bring the thread back forward. We're going to put the wings on first, which is a little contrary to popular opinion, but I think this will work a little easier to build a nice smooth underbody. I'm going to bump the thread back up to about the 75% point on the hook and leave it hanging there while I stack a clump of calf body for the wings. When you look at a piece of calf body hair, you want to try to get hair that is as long as you can get. It's relatively short to start with, so the longer you can start, the better off you'll be. And I'm going to take a large clump of this, and I want to make sure I clean out all the short hairs and underfur out of it. You've got to keep in mind that you're going to use this clump to make 2 wings that are going to be relatively heavy, so it's a bigger clump than you'll probably be used to. Although I will say to start with, it might be easier to work with a little less hair than too much. So you may start a little light and work up to using more hair as you get more comfortable with the technique. Once I've got that hair cleaned out, I'm going to put it in my larger diameter stacker. This hair has a little bit of wave to it. It's not perfectly straight, so a little more room inside the stacker will allow that hair to shake down and get even at the bottom. So I've stacked this hair up and I've got a nice, neat, tidy bunch, and I feel like I've got a little more than I need here, so I'm going to thin some out. Don't be afraid to scale things down. It's just like dubbing. Just because you've got it there doesn't mean you have to use all of it. So I'll take that clump of hair, I'm going to measure it against the hook shank so it's a shank length long, and again I've got my thread hanging at the 75% point. You can see the way I'm measuring this is I can kind of roll my fingers back here, and I'll just slide my fingers forward till they're even with the bend of the hook, and that'll tell me where 1 shank length is. Once I'm happy with that measurement, I'll set the hair down again, and I'll put 2 turns around the hair and tighten the thread toward me. Now you can see as I tighten the thread on this hair, it doesn't react like deer or elk hair would. It has no flare at all. It's a very solid hair. So I'm just going to anchor it with those 2 turns, and then I'm going to form a thread band traveling back toward the bend of the hook. That's about 2 eye lengths wide. Now before I go on, I'm going to trim these butt ends, and I want to trim these at an angle. I'm going to come in from the back side of the hook, and I'm going to trim this hair so that it comes from the hook shank up to the diameter of that thread band. Now I'm going to continue the thread back to the bend of the hook. And you can see how that'll run right down those butt ends, forming a smooth shape as we come back. Now we're going to tie our tail in. We're going to come back and divide the wings here in a minute, but we're going to tie the tail in next. I'm going to take a small clump of this moose hawk, and again I'll clean it out like any other hair, and I'm probably going to end up with 12 or 15 hairs by the time this is all said and done. And that's for a size 14. If you're tying a smaller fly, obviously you'll use a few less. I'm going to stack this one more time just to get everything even. Now I can take this clump of hair and I can do one of two things. I want to measure it a shank length long. So I can either measure it against the hook shank itself, or I can measure it against the wings. Your wing should be a shank length long, so if you're confident, just go ahead and measure right against the wing. But ultimately we want a shank length long. I'll set that one shank length long base point right at the bend, and I'll catch the hair with a few turns, making a band of thread traveling forward. So I've got my tail coming right off the bend of the hook. Now we're going to try to segue the butt ends of the wing into the butt ends of the tail so we don't have a big step between the two. And that's part of that tapered cut that we made on the butts of the wing. We're going to joint the butt ends of the tail right into that. And to do that, I'm going to lift these butt ends up just at a slight angle, and I'll come across the top with the scissors, trying to keep them flat, and I'll trim those butt ends off. And you can see how the butt ends of the tail now will fit right into the taper of the wing butts. And as I wrap forward over those, I don't have a step or a bump anywhere along there. I'm going to close my fingers under the hook and drag all the hair up and back. I'm going to build a wedge of thread up against the front edge of the wing to really prop this hair up at a 90-degree angle to the hook shank. Now as I did that, this calf body hair is a little softer than the deer and elk hair that we've worked with. So you can see that it's spread out a bit. To gather that into one clump, I'm going to hold that up in my thread hand and take a wrap of thread from the front of the wing to the back 2 times. And that just sort of regroups that bundle so it's a little more clean. Now I'm going to turn my vise just a bit, and I'll divide this clump of hair into 2 parts. Try to get as equal as you can. If you get one wing heavier than the other, especially if it's significantly heavier, it'll make this fly twist on your leader and make it much more difficult to cast. Once I'm happy with the half and half division there, I'm going to go from the back near side of the wings to the front far side with 5 or 6 diagonal turns. And then I'll take a wrap of thread around the hook. Now I'm going to turn the hook a little bit toward me, and I'm going to come from the front near side to the back far side with 5 or 6 more turns and around the hook. And that's Xing the wings. That's going to divide the wings into 2 separate clumps. And you can see that tilted the wings a little bit further forward than we started, but that's okay. We're going to come around that here in a minute. Now we're going to post the wing. And I'll start with my far wing. I'm going to turn my vise just a little bit, and I post counterclockwise, tying left-handed, up the base of the wing about an eye length. Once I get that wing tweaked in position, I can just come around the hook and lock it down with a turn of thread. I'll do the same thing on this side, except rather than turning everything upside down, same position, just the other direction, and lock it in place with a wrap around the hook. So now we've got 2 nice upright divided hair wings. They're going to be very visible, very buoyant, makes the fly a lot easier to follow. Now we're going to tie in a piece of fine copper wire. And this is just for reinforcement. This body has got peacock curl on it, and it's not a terribly durable material. So we're going to try to add a little bit of durability to this with just a wire rib. So I'm going to tie this wire rib in just behind the wings, and I'll wrap back over it all the way to the base of the tail. Now at this point I'm going to add just a small drop of head cement here to the wing and tail construction. And typically when I tie a bunch of these, I'll tie just up to this point, just short of the wire I should say, and add a drop of cement just to kind of lock everything in. We've got a lot of thread work there. I like to use a thin cement. I'll put a drop right at the base of the wings and just run it right down the shank. I don't wait terribly long for that to dry. If you use thin head cement, it's not going to take very long anyway. Sort of dab that up a little bit. Now we're going to tie our peacock curl in. On a fly like this, I like to use that finer peacock curl from the eyed quill. Just a little more appropriate. Unless you get onto a really big Royal Wullf, we want to use a little finer peacock curl. So I'll take 6 or 8 of these. I'm going to trim the ends, the tip ends, square. I'll tie these down right in front of the base of the tail, and I'll move the thread forward to just in front of the hook point. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make the body section into 3 pieces. So essentially the back 60% of the hook or so, we're going to divide into 3 sections. 20% peacock curl, 20% red floss, and 20% peacock curl again. So to start with this first bunch, I'm going to take this peacock and I'm going to roll it in my fingers just a bit to create a cord. You don't want to twist it up too much on the first few wraps because you've got the very fine tips and it can break. So I'm going to get a couple turns on there to start, and then as I work forward I can continue that twist to make a nice bushy rope. Once I've got up to about even with the hook point, I'll tie that off. Now a lot of tiers will just lay this peacock down and run the thread forward over it and use this thicker portion for the front bunch, but I find it's disproportioned. You've got a real big bunch at the front and a smaller bunch at the back. So I'm going to cut this off, and I'll tie in a separate bunch when we get to the front. Now I'm going to run my thread forward to about the 60% point, and this is where we'll tie in our red floss. I like to use a single strand floss, or if you're using multi-stranded floss, just use a single strand of it. And I like to separate these. It makes it a little easier to wrap the body. Even a single strand is still relatively heavy, and you can see this floss is twisted, and as I unwind it, it'll start to divide into multiple strands. I'll take my scissor blades and just place it between the strands, right at the center, and peel it apart so I can divide that into at least 2, if not many more. On this size fly, half of a strand is going to be about right. I'll trim the end of this square. I'll tie the floss in at the 60% point, and I'll anchor it down with a few turns. Now I'll start to wrap back to the base of that first bunch of peacock. I'll wrap all the way back to the front edge, and then I'll come forward again, just making a second layer as I come back over it. It's sort of a 2-layer body with 1 tie-off point. Another trick you can do right here is we tied that on with 3 turns. I can undo 2 of those turns and tie it on and off with the same 2 turns. A little less thread bulk, especially on a fly like this that's busy. Lots of pieces on it. Now you can see I've wrapped that red floss all the way up to the 60% point, so it doesn't seem like we're going to have room to put that second bunch of peacock in and still have room for our hackle, but we've got a plan for that as well. I'm going to take another half dozen strands of peacock row, trim the tip square. I'll tie these in at the 60% point and just slightly overlap the front edge of that red floss body. I'll twist these up the same way that we did at the back, and I'll start to wrap, but you want to keep in mind that you've got to have some room here between the front edge of the second bunch of peacock and the wings to put your hackle in. So don't go all the way up to the wings. Tie that floss, or tie that peacock off and trim those stubs. And then I could just smooth the butt ends off. And you can see we've still got the room to put the hackle in between. Now I'm going to wrap my wire rib. And this wire rib, I'm just going to wrap like there was nothing in between it. We're going to wrap right straight forward over both bunches of peacock and the red floss just to reinforce things. And I'm going to go relatively closely spaced wraps just to bind everything down and make sure it doesn't come loose later. Tie that wire off with a few turns and break off the excess. Now we've got 2 brown hackles. These are saddle feathers, and I like these on these big attractor drives because they're a little denser. About 1.5 hook gaps is the hackle size that we're after. I'm going to strip the base of these feathers about 1/2 shank. I'm going to tie this in right at the front edge of that first bunch of peacock. And I'll wrap forward over it up to the base of the wings, and then I'll cross and cover the stubs right up to the base of the hook eye. Now we're ready to wrap our hackle. I'm going to take both these feathers, I'm going to pull straight up, come straight down on the far side of the hook. I'll make 2 or 3 turns here behind the wing. Then I'm going to come and just slide the wings back, put the next turn right at the front edge of the wings. I'm going to pull the hackle straight up, take the thread straight up and over to bind it down just behind the hook eye. I'm going to reach in and grab the base of the hackle feathers and trim them out with my fine tip scissors. Build just a smooth little thread head, and we'll whip finish right over that thread head. Trim that thread off, and that's our Royal Wullf, one of the prettiest flies around.